Welcome to Leadership on the Front Foot, where we discuss a wide range of leadership topics and we talk with some of our community's best and brightest leaders. Leadership on the Front Foot is recorded in front of a live audience, so feel free to pose a question to me at any time by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll get to as many of those as I possibly can during our time together. The recording of Leadership on the Front Foot is going to be available on the Capital Partners website, on YouTube, but also on your favourite podcast platform in a couple of weeks from now. So if you like what you hear, don't hesitate to share it with family and friends and hit the like button. Now, as the social consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic start to be eased, the restrictions start to be eased, I feel as though there's a tendency in the community to feel as though it's all over and that it's time to move on. Now, anyone in business, certainly people running businesses, company directors and the like, know that that's far from true. Any company director will tell you that this is going to be a long recovery process to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the way we lead our businesses, the way we lead our community, and the way we lead our families is going to really determine how we come out of this. And to help us unpack this topic today, I am delighted to welcome Diane Smith-Gander AO. Now, Diane is a leader in the true sense of the word, a prominent company director. She is Chair of Safe Work Australia and the Council for the Economic Development of Australia, Chair of Chief Executive Women, a Director of Cooperative Bulk Handling, CEDA, and she's also an Adjunct Professor of Governance at UWA. So Diane, thank you for being with us today on Leadership on the Front Foot.
I'm very happy to be here,
Excellent.
David. Thank you. It's great to have an opportunity to interact with your wider community.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to hit off with how you got where you got. You're enjoying real success these days and it's hard earned. I wouldn't mind if you could just walk us through some of the start of the journey and how you've actually got where you've got.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, obviously there's a very long version of the story and there's a much shorter version as well. But really at the core of it is I was born in Woodside Hospital in Dalgety Street, East Fremantle, and can you believe it? I live in East Fremantle today. So I haven't moved very far, but for 24 years I wasn't in Perth. I was pursuing a career elsewhere. And people say to me, oh, you did all these great things. You worked with McKinsey in the United States and counselled really large corporations all over the globe on major transformation matters. And you were a big deal at Westpac Banking Corporation on a couple of times, So you must have had a great career plan and really worked hard to push your way up the ladder. It wasn't really like that at all. So it's always interesting to reflect back, when you ask a question like you just asked me, to go, well, how did it come about? Because I have been fortunate and I do feel I'm successful and it gives me an opportunity to do things I'm sure many people would really aspire to do. I was asked once by a group of young men in a fraternity meeting at the University of Utah, what's been your biggest challenge in your career to date, Diane? What's been your single biggest challenge? And for once in my life, I was really honest and I just looked at these young men and I said, actually being a woman in a corporate setting has been my biggest challenge.
Yeah,
so
that's amazing. We're going to spend some time on that topic.
Yeah, we will.
I think that's very important. And but I want to come back to that. I'm going to loop back to that. I want to give our audience a bit of a flavour. I think everyone knows the legal construct of company director, some better than others, of course, but I'm really interested in what's a day look like for you.
It's been very different, but in a way, being a non-executive director suits the hermit lifestyle a little bit. Many organisations had pandemic risk on their risk matrix, but really hadn't unpacked what that meant. I had a lovely moment with Michael Chaney at the Wesfarmers board where we were talking about, well, what does it mean and how would you set a risk appetite? And Michael said, well, the best defence against this sort of risk is a really strong balance sheet. And everybody just went, oh, of course. But then we had a dig at him and said, but you say that to every risk. The best mitigant is a really strong balance sheet. And really ain't that.
Yeah,
thing.
so
So
true.
it is about understanding in each setting, what is it the company does really well? And what does Wesfarmers do? Well, it's an allocator of capital across a portfolio. And to be able to do that effectively, what do you need? A really strong balance sheet, but very different in other places.
So there's something that's become really evident to us in the financial planning and investment management space in the last little while, and that is that true risk is what's left when you've thought of everything else. You know, when you've considered every other contingency and you're left with this outlier that occurs. How are, you know, just in broad terms, the organisations that you're working with viewing that, you know, because it's, you know, running an airport, that's a complicated business. And
yeah, it's this interesting, this notion of, you know, what's a black swan? What is the risk that's left after you've put in place sensible mitigations? And, you know, how do you think about that? I think a lot of people are understanding that the definition of a black swan is not a pandemic, because it's not as if we couldn't have looked back into history.
Yeah.
We knew coronaviruses existed. We knew that there were viruses that could transmit from animals to humans for which there were no vaccines. We knew that there were really bad diseases like HIV/AIDS and so forth for which we've got treatment but no vaccines. So you couldn't really call a pandemic a black swan. But what you could see was that a lot of organisations hadn't thought through what really was the connection between a lot of the risks on their risk map. So you look at the moment and you see things like rapid currency movements, you know, high volatility there. You see disruption in supply chains. For Western Australia, where we are, you see China doing things that are very unusual. You know, just announcing that they're not going to put out planning numbers. You know, imagine a world where China doesn't actually do that. You know, so these risks, which would have been sitting on your risk map, have now got a connection that perhaps you never really understood before. So I would say to you that I'm not sure that the true risk is what's left after you've done all the mitigations, but that it's more around the connections between the risks and how that will play out.
so you might have had all of those risks on your map, but you never expected them all to be, all four of them to be joined together.
Connected in the way that they actually are.
So that leads to a really good, interesting question around leadership. You know, you've dealt with some pretty big names historically. You know, what do you see in the people you've dealt with over the years, the people you've really admired, the leaders you've really admired, the behaviours, and what are you seeing as the most effective leadership styles through this right now?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because one of the things that's becoming really clear to me about the situation we're in at the moment is that it hasn't really caused what you might call a fundamental disruption to what had been going on in our markets. What it's actually done is it's accelerated and it's exacerbated the strategic trends that we were seeing. You think about disruption and the move to online shopping. That was already well in motion. And we already had the geopolitical issues around China and people starting to think about, oh, you know, if we've got these globalised supply chains and they're all linked up to each other, and then you get a president like Trump in the US that doesn't respect that and throws landmines into the system. Well, we're already seeing, you know, some of these issues. And so what the current situation has done is it's really accelerated things. And so what it's meant for leaders is that they're now in a situation where their leadership style is really going to be tested because the pace is much greater. And so what they've got in the kit bag is, let's face it, what they've got in the kit bag, but it's being tested, you know, in a very, very different way. When I was at McKinsey, I did a lot of change of control work, and you'd see a chief executive would successfully ink the deal, be getting ready to announce it, and then he'd go, okay, now I've got to integrate these two things. And I was the integration person here too. So, well, Diane, tell me, what can I do to be really successful in this integration? How are you going to help me? And I'd say, look, I can stop you from making any of the really doofus mistakes, but it's what you've done the last 2 years that's actually earned you the right to lead through this. And you're going to have to lead in an authentic way. So I've always felt that leaders need to understand their own strengths and work on those strengths. Know your weaknesses, but don't spend a huge amount of time trying to fix those weaknesses, because you're going to spend a whole lot of effort for not much return. You're much better to look around your team and make sure that every single person in your team does something better than you, and that any weaker areas that you've got, and obviously there are foundational levels you've got to hit, but any weaker areas your team backs you up on. And you're seeing that in spades now, because what you're seeing is people's real authentic leadership is coming out. And the ones that are strong leaders are leaning in towards the problems, and the ones that don't have that real strength of bench and team are sort of leaning back away from the problem.
Interesting.
So all of the things that we've known are great leadership traits, great communication, a really strongly held vision that you're prepared to, walk as well as talk. You back that up, and with a, really sensible understanding of how your business operates, and that helicopter ability that when there is a problem, you can dive down into that problem, really get your hands dirty as a leader, but you know when to pull back out. So at the moment, I see a lot of leaders who are a bit immature in their leadership are behaving like the 7-year-olds with the footy. When you watch 7-year-olds play, the footy goes and everyone runs after the footy. Because at the end of the day, this is the single most interesting, exciting and stretching thing that has happened in any of our careers. And so everybody wants to be part of it. So you talked before about the non-executive directors. The thing at the moment, we always say non-executive directors have got our noses in and our fingers out. Well, at the moment, I'm having to sit on my hands, because often the best thing I can do is actually do nothing.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you are a doer. You get stuff done.
I am.
I've known you for a long time, and you get stuff done. How hard is it in that transition from company executive? So you were very senior at Westpac, like sort of one from the top at sort of Westpac. How hard is it to sit on your hands when you transition? You've been a doer all your career, and then all of a sudden you have to be a looker and a nudger.
Yeah, and it wasn't easy for the first couple of years, because particularly some of the expertise areas that I had around IT and how business and information technology interact, and how you make good prioritisation and investment decisions around those areas were very topical. There was a lot of moves, the cloud was starting to happen. Cyber was becoming a really big topic area. So I had topic expertise, and I also had much stronger view than many of my fellow directors around just the basics of cyber. So I would get the audit reports and the user access control, password sharing, all of this basic stuff, the stuff that we talk about, or you wouldn't leave your front door open at home, please close the door on your IT systems. That was not in the shape it needed to be. And of course it drove me completely nuts. And it took me quite a while to learn how to get that balance right. I remember one chairman said to me, look, you've got 3 years before you go up to the shareholders for re-election. Think about that as the time frame to build that foundational director kit, to be at the point where you really think you're bringing your power to bear in the boardroom, and check in during the board performance reviews and see how that's going, and check in with your peers. And so I started taking that approach, and I learned faster as a result. You always learn better when you're mentored. And I had one really experienced female company director, and she said to me, let me show you something. And she pulled out this book that she used to bring into all the board meetings. She flipped over to the back page, and there was this long list, and there must have been 22 items on it. And halfway down, a couple had been crossed out, and one at the top had gone. And she said, this is my list for our board. And I know that there are these 19 things left on my list of 22. But I think that at each board meeting, I might be able to get 3 or 4 of them out. And my job is to understand which are the ones that can't wait. And then I take those to the chair and do that in the private session and see if I'm on the same page as my colleagues. Otherwise, I'll sort of let that gracefully drop. But when an opportunity comes up in the board where there's a moment where the conversation might be heading in that direction, it's a bit unfrozen, that's when I pick question number 19. And it was really fascinating to get that coaching to learn how to be much calmer as a director. You know, and I think over the last little while, having calm boards and calm CEOs, calm government, you know, this is really a very important part. And we can see that just comparing the behaviour of our leaders, our political leaders, with people like Donald Trump. Yeah, I mean, you know, we've done pretty well. We've only talked about him twice, you know. And I do think you can see that calmness, and people really look for that measured leadership at this time.
We talked last week about resilience in business, and you were just saying how important resilience is. I wonder if we could just unpack that a little bit. Yeah,
it's a really important thing for me, you know, because as somebody who's made a number of transitions, you know, I talked about, you know, going to Melbourne High and doing my degrees my part-time. You know, when I moved from Perth over to Sydney in the middle 80s and sort of got into advertising and marketing and the management consulting, that was a big transition. And then when I moved into Westpac, and my career really accelerated very quickly through doing ability, as you talked about, and the jobs got bigger and the stakes got higher. And then I went offshore to McKinsey when I didn't quite get what I wanted out of my career at Westpac, and then 8 years later came back for family reasons. You know, those big transitions, I really feel that it wasn't until I'd made that last transition back to Australia that I sort of took enough time to think, well, what is it about me? What do I want to do for the next bit? Stop just saying yes and getting on with it and having fun, and do a teeny bit of planning. And actually the conversations that you and I had about money, you know, and how you think about that, was actually a part of that for me, where it was taking a bit of time for myself. And I certainly learnt that my resilience comes because I'm an introverted person. I love this one-on-one conversation. I like the hermit lifestyle with my board book. And to realise that although I had these extrovert coping skills and I was very happy with set pieces and running big teams and leading large projects and so forth, that if there wasn't enough time for me to reground myself and draw energy from time by myself or time with one other person, or indeed time with the dog, that I wasn't going to be as effective. You know, I played basketball for a long time, and so being fit and healthy is important to me as well. And I have a connection of people that I've worked with over the years that are spread from one end of the globe to the other, and keeping that connection is really important, working out how to make that happen. So I know that if I don't focus on those things and provide enough time for it, that the bad Diane is coming out to have a little play, and nobody wants that. So resilience for me, it's not about picking up a book that says here's resilience. It's about giving yourself enough credit to diagnose yourself, look into yourself, work out what it is that makes you the best version of yourself you can be, and want to do that, and want to invest the time, the energy, and sometimes the money in that process. And that will build resilience. Nobody else can do it for you. This is actually only something you can do, and you make deposits in that resilience bank, and then when you get to a time like now, you withdraw them. Keep a really close eye on when the balance gets low.
Yeah. And I bet you see that day to day.
Yeah, you do.
You're working with.
Yeah. And this is when it can be the hardest as a non-executive director, when you see executives that you've got a lot of time for, that you're invested in, and you can see them struggling with something, and working out when you would say to a chairman or to the CEO or directly to that executive, you know, take a bit of a risk and insert yourself a little bit in that process. And what I've observed over the last little while is that CEOs and chairs, the really good ones, have been way more open to thinking about that. Okay, things are very busy here. A lot of people have been taking things off the work order, and that's entirely appropriate, that reprioritisation.
Just put it on ice for a while.
Yeah, you know, it can go on that back burner. But in some other places where you don't have the opportunity to do that, can you use some of the skill that you've got with your non-executive directors? And often in the non-listed environment, that's more typical to occur. But, you know, most boards have processes in place if you want to get services from a director and how you think about doing that.
So let's move then from personal resilience to the resilience of our broader community and indeed our country, because a lot's going to change coming out of COVID-19. You know, a lot's going to change. So just walk us through your view, your thoughts on what do you think the big trends are going to be, and what do you think we need to look out for as individuals in terms of, you know, just being on trend?
Yeah, interesting. We talked before about risk. I think people's understanding and attitude of risk has changed forever. You know, there's been a real groundswell in the last, you know, it's probably been going on for 30 years around safety at work and a greater expectation that organisations would always create a safe workplace and do really good hazard assessments, and, you know, no one should go home in a different situation to what they arrived at work. But I think that has really moved forward. People understand a great deal more now what care looks like, and they also understand more about the psychosocial bits. So we were already well moving in Australia to understanding psychosocial health and how to deal with that at work. But this has just moved it to warp speed, you know, pretty much overnight. And I think that's a really positive and healthy thing. And that's going to help organisations become way more resilient in themselves. Also, the working from...
How so?
Well, because I think when you are understanding that a person is that whole package, and the mental health is part of that, and you can have a more courageous conversation, a good two-way conversation with someone about their aspirations and their desires. You know, one of the things that the Committee for Perth found around their Filling the Pool study, which was around, you know, why Perth had such bad gender outcomes, was that where there were good outcomes, there was a lot of emphasis on leaders having these very courageous conversations with their people, and their people being prepared to participate. And I'd stand up in front of groups of senior men and say, I'm here giving you permission to ask all those questions that you thought were discriminatory and politically incorrect, like, are you planning on having children? You can actually ask both men and women that question. If you do that, do you think you'll come back from maternity leave fast, or will you be gone for a long time? Now, if that question is about, I want to work out how to manage my workforce so that the training and development I give you isn't going to be wasted, you're always going to come back, return to work and work effectively, I can give you flexibility in working from home. If that's what that conversation's about, it's a really good one.
Yeah.
You know,
and your view is that people shy away from that?
I think they do, because they worry that they're going to be seen to be asking the question for an inappropriate reason, like, you know, I'm going to not give you training because if you're going to be a mum, you're going to go off, and so forth. So, you know, we have now worked out that we can do a lot more work from home. We can cut commute times down. We can save money by not having to fly backwards and forwards between Sydney and Melbourne, you know, and you always go with a mate, you know, it's like bloody Noah's Ark, 2 by 2 on the animals went. So all of those things are really changing the way organisations perceive risk, but I think they're also making organisations way more resilient. Now, we've also learnt, you know, that those that did disaster recovery testing and business continuity planning and thought about working from home and so forth are in much better shape than those that didn't.
Before we leave that, I do want to get your thoughts on supply chains. You know, it's really clear that we've got some gaping holes in terms of our resilience as an economy. So what do you think is going to change as a result of COVID?
Well, everyone is going to take a much different approach to the risk they think they've got in their supply chain. It's that sort of connected risk thing that I talked about before. And it does mean that I think we will see some things come back onshore. So back in the day when I was at Westpac, we offshored a lot of stuff into India. And the reasons that we did that was because there was a huge labour arbitrage, and there was also a bigger pool of technically qualified people than we could actually access in Australia. Now, those two things haven't changed that much, but there are some other things that have changed. And one of those is that cloud technologies are much more sensible these days, you know, and accessible. And we've developed really better data management controls. And I think a lot of that comes from the privacy legislation that came out of the EU recently. And, you know, everyone's got a soft phone now, so technology can easily go home. Because I remember one of the big projects I did for Westpac where we removed the back office from the branches. we ended up with a couple of problems. One was a lot of excess space in the branches. And because of the money and the value there, you know, it's very hard to sublease the space. So you wanted to be able to use it for the bank's purposes. And we had a lot of tasks that were no longer there, or tasks that were done in a very short period of time. So it was really hard to construct full-time jobs. And people were used to full-time jobs, and I think most people generally want a full-time job, or at least a very stable job. And we were really keen to try to take some of the telephone traffic and volume and put it into the branches, because the people had the time to do it, they had the skill to do it, we had the space, but we couldn't do it because the technology wasn't caught up with us. But today you could actually do that. So I think some of the settings will be quite different. And while the labour arbitrage is still there, and the pools of labour are very different offshore than they are in Australia, I think we will give some weighting to disruption and to risk, and also to just having jobs in Australia. So I think that's what's going to cause the supply chain to change around some of those white collar worker processes. But to think that we're going to suddenly start advanced manufacturing overnight, or really change some of those supply chains that are more around things that are manufactured, the widget supply chains, I think is really pretty much a pipe dream, sadly. But we will have to, over time, change some of these things, because I think people will be really uncomfortable on relying on medical type products purely from offshore, and we want to think about some level of homegrown manufacturing capability.
And at the very least, it's going to redefine just in time.
Yes, indeed.
We've got a couple of great questions coming in, Diane.
Great.
I'm really keen to get your view on these. I'd like to ask Diane's opinion on the professionalism of our government organisations in the modern world. So this is not a COVID thing, this is a more general thing. It seems many decisions and subsequent arrangements are poorly handled. Interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. Doesn't it come back to this question about what's the role of government? And like I said before, what COVID's done is it's just made everything go faster and be, more important. And so it makes some of the issues, very clear compared to maybe what they were a couple of months ago. But certainly what is happening at the moment is government is moving into doing more things and making more decisions. It will be interesting to see how easy it is to get them to pull back. The helicopter thing I talked about, yes, you've been down there doing it's been very important, but would you please go back up to the level of governance that you're supposed to be at? I don't sense here in Western Australia we're going to have too much trouble with that. I think the leadership here has done a very fine job of working out where they need to insert themselves, but still allowing others to get jobs done. In some of the other states, perhaps not quite so much. And I think that's going to be a real problem for us, because while I think government has done a very good job of saying what we can't do, it's been much harder for them to support through this process of reopening and now what you can do.
Yeah.
And the people that have been making, from my mind, the really big strides there are individual employers, particularly large ones, who have just seen this as their responsibility and got on with it. And I think the Prime Minister's been quite clear about that. But also the industry bodies and associations, the chambers of commerce and so forth, like the Australian Hoteliers Association here, that Bradley Woods leads, very front foot about, well, if we are going to reopen, what would we need? What would be the pieces of the puzzle? And what guidance can we give? And how can we, have people clear about what their responsibilities are and are not? And I think we're doing a really nice job of that here. So I think it's when government steps past their core constitutional roles and tries to get too much into service delivery and too much into impacting the rules that sit in our market, i.e. too much regulation, that we start to have problems. So I don't think it's so much a lack of professionalism, but I think it's misunderstanding some of their scope creep and doing things that are unnatural acts for government.
Overreach.
Yeah, overreach would be a really nice way to describe it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is an interesting one. It's sort of related to the conversation we were having just a minute ago. Has corporate Australia lost its resilience to withstand global shocks?
Yeah, see, I don't think so at all. I think corporate Australia has done a good job of responding to this, but I think where this question is going to is the supply chain question, which basically says that, if we have to bring activity here, or we have to do things in a really different way, what's our capacity and our capability to do that? And that's not where it needs to be.
And for the most part, not easy. This is not an easy one to
manage.
manage.
No, it's not an easy one to just manage.
Yeah, absolutely. I am really keen to spend a bit of time coming back to your journey around the gender diversity piece, because you are a great advocate for gender diversity. Some could argue that makes sense because you're a woman. I
Yes,
get that.
of course.
But I know that I happen to know there's a lot more to it than that. I wonder if you could just outline for us your philosophy, if you will, your broad brush, the overarching drivers view of why you're so passionate about this as an issue.
It's been an interesting journey for me because it really wasn't until about 10 years ago, when I was in my early 50s, that I started to realise that I could actually have a voice, and a really important voice, and be somebody who could move the dial. And there were some things that I found I could just open my mouth and say. You know, it was the time of the 30% club and people getting, you know, maybe we could have a target that was 40, 40, 20. And I went, hang on a tick. Women are 51% of the population. We should have 51% of the power. 51% of the seats in Parliament, 51% of the board seats, 51% of the CEO roles. Doesn't make any sense. You know, and it's not like when you get up to
That's like saying water finds its level.
Exactly.
Like it's not,
you know, to me it was just,
thing.
you know, and when I said it and everybody went, oh, then I suddenly realised, okay, yeah, there is that 30% club thing that's happening here. And people were saying, you know, 30% is great because 3 out of 10, you're not the only one. It's not just you and one other person. 3, you've got a bit more voice here. They sort of notice you. You don't look like such an outlier. And I was like, oh, this is tripe. It's just got no integrity, or, you know, a target like that. Then I thought, well, if you're a woman, that sort of resonates. You know, it feels right. And certainly there's a social justice argument there. And, you know, I'm finding, you know, a lot of blokes your age that have daughters and, you know, that when their daughters butt up against discrimination and the non-level playing field and so forth, and assumptions about what they may or may not want to do, you know, a lot of those men get religion. But it was pretty clear to me that you couldn't just rely on that. And I started just to talk to a lot of men of a certain age about, well, what is your view on this? And it was quite interesting when you start telling them what their view should be and ask them what their view actually was. Surprise, surprise, you learned something that was quite helpful. And what I basically learned was that most of the senior men that I spoke to just didn't believe the business case. There was stuff going on about, oh, well, more diverse teams do better decision making. And this study done by that university, this sliver of companies in the US, they had a higher return. No one believed any of it. So I was sort of, I wonder what the business case really is. So I sort of challenged myself, could I understand really what the business case was? And I was president of Chief Executive Women at the time, and I put the bite on all of the big accounting firms and all of the big strategy firms to work pro bono for us at the time. It was really interesting. I used to get up in public and say, don't be the first person that says no to me when I ask for a free engagement. And so I dug a lot into the numbers. And what became very clear to me was there actually is no case whatsoever for bringing women into the workforce, educating them, giving them training and development, and then throwing them away because they're going to have children or they want to have caring responsibilities that are more broader than, you know, just being at work. And when you added that together to the fact that the population is ageing and the type of work that Australians want to do and the way our economy is constructed meant that we were going to be running out of workers at a rapid rate, and that people were starting to get a bit concerned about, you know, the infrastructure issues around growing the population through migration all the time. It became pretty clear that there was a very strong case for being more sensible about how you retained women. And when you add into that the fact that if you take a child when they're very young and you put them into early childhood education, a lot of which is playing, because that's how kids learn early on. So it might look like play, but it's actually early childhood education. When you do that, you find a cohort of children that, sad to talk about it this way, but the total cost of ownership of that citizen over its life is way less than the total cost of ownership of a kid that doesn't build good hygiene habits, good eating habits, good exercise habits, and doesn't want to aspire to do something with their life. You know, the kids that are in that cohort, that sad cohort, cost us a lot more as a society. The kids that come through really strong early childhood education and very quickly become contributors. So I sort of felt that you put all of this together, it makes a really solid business case for doing better by women and not just always seeing them as someone who does a second job, a part-time job, a very casualised job that can sort of be turned on and off.
Yeah, and I'm interested too in this COVID thing. You talked earlier about we've just got good. at working from home.
Yeah.
And no one thought we were going to do that, because a lot of employers have had this view that, yeah, sure, working from home. Well, now it's a thing. Like, everyone just does it and you get your work done.
Yeah, it's not that easy. I mean, if you've got a toddler or you've got a 7-year-old
totally.
that needs to be supervised, that ain't the easiest thing. Or if you've got, a shift worker husband who thinks, well, it's great you're home now, you can make me stroganoff for lunch every day, these sorts of things. You've got to work through all of that, because you're working or you're caring. You can't sort of task shift simultaneously between those two things. It's actually sort of illegal if you think it through. So we've got a bit of work to do there, but I do think we have realised that a lot of these risks we thought were in these systems, and the potential for people to do the wrong thing is nowhere near as high as we initially thought it was.
Yeah. Let me just pause there. We've got a couple of good questions coming through on the screen, and I do want to make sure...
Does that mean we've got some bad ones as well?
No.
I want the bad ones.
Okay, yeah, this is good, actually. I'll paraphrase it.
Okay, I haven't got my reading glasses.
Yeah,
so
no. So how do we have the conversation? And it's posed in the context of company directors.
Yeah.
But I think this is a much broader question.
Okay.
There's an expectation that you're in a crisis, that a question gets asked and you have to get a crisis response. And the question here is about, hang on, how do we have the conversation with people about, I don't know the answer to that. I'm just going to have to think about that for a while. I'm going to have to ponder that for a while, and I'll come back to you. And I guess it's that, rugged individual leader versus the considered...
This is very important. This is a really insightful thing. One of the hardest things to say as a leader is, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Followed by, what do you think? And when you think about the question, what do you think? That is such a fantastic question. I think you could get through an entire board career only asking that question. What do you think?
If you followed it up with...
Tell me more.
If you followed it up with, is that true?
Yes, tell me more.
You could go a long way. Yeah, exactly.
You could go, and you would learn a great deal more than some non-executive directors do. I hate that business of, I give you my credentials by telling you my hypothesis, and now I ask you a question. Well, where on earth has management got to go at the end of that sort of a description? So I do think there are so many things at the moment that we do not know the answer to. The science is really unclear. We don't know whether we're going to get a vaccine to this thing.
Ever.
We don't know what the mortality rates are, because we haven't had enough experience and we haven't got all the data in. And we know that in some countries, the ability to actually measure the numbers in the immediacy is very low. So it's going to take time. We don't know whether people can get reinfected, and if they get reinfected, are they infectious? We really don't know how infectious this thing is. It just sort of goes on and on. So I think there's been lots of opportunities recently for people to say, I don't know. I think Mark McGowan here in WA has done a pretty good job at times saying, I don't know. One of the beautiful things he's done is a really good piece of leadership kit to carry with you, which is where you say, I don't know the answer to that question, I don't have the content, but I can tell you what the process is to get to an answer. Every 3 weeks, I'm going to talk to you about X, Y, Z. I'm going to give you these numbers. I'm going to work out from these numbers when are the triggers for me to change decisions I've made. That type of signposting and signalling is, I think, a really good leadership behaviour that allows you to feel a bit more comfortable about saying, I don't know. It's a very uncomfortable thing to say.
But it's incredibly important.
It's very important.
Because the inverse is potentially so destructive.
Yeah, so I really like that question. Yeah. So thank you for whoever raised that. And maybe
that was Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Good on you, Sarah. And maybe we should all give ourselves a task to 3 times a day say truthfully when you don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Something. Or another good one, I don't know how to do this. Could you help me?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Don't know how to think about this. Tell me what you think.
This is from Venetia, who's a great friend of ours. I'd like Diane's view about what are the 3 macro issues that organisations need to be focusing on in the latter part of 2020 and beyond.
Wow. I mean, to a degree it depends, but let's face it, what are organisations going to have to focus on? Revenue, wherever your revenue comes from, because if you can create new sources of revenue, then you can protect cash, because cash is going to be the thing. And you see so much of what's been going on with what government's been trying to do with JobSeeker and JobKeeper and the support to the lending institutions and so forth. It's all about keeping that cash out in the economy. So revenue is really important, because that's what greases the skids of your business. So thinking about that, and of course that takes you to all those deep questions about how relevant am I to the customer, and what is it that my proposition is really offering, and will it continue to resonate. Second thing, of course, is people, because we can't run our organisations without people. And there we go again, you know, the government doing something good, JobKeeper, rather than shoving everybody off to Centrelink, let's keep the relationship between the employer and the employee, so that
so important,
the business can be ready to have a go. What would be the third thing? There's so many that you could actually pick. I think it's probably going to have to be some sort of notion around safety. Safety for your people, safety for your customers, those sort of confidence issues, because that's what will drive that revenue. So maybe I could have shoehorned that into revenue and given myself another thing in my three answers. But I think that's it: safety, people, revenue.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Venetia. I do, though, want to come back, Diane. I think we've potentially skimmed over a little bit the gender question. You've talked about what drives you, and I think that's great. You don't know this one's coming. If we're having this conversation 10 years from now, what's got to fundamentally change for you to feel that we've made genuine progress on the gender diversity issue?
You know, for me, 50-50 is the goal. And sadly, I don't think that'll happen in my lifetime, in terms of it being ubiquitous across all the arenas, and things like never seeing another book on the bookshelf, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or whichever the way around that went. You know, this notion that men and women are different, I don't think we're actually that different. I think our experiences drive us to difference, and that when we have more like-for-like experiences, some of those sort of stylistic differences will fall away. But really, I want to see that women have equal opportunity. It's not about equal outcomes. I genuinely believe that once given equal opportunity, that women will just rise through the system. But because the system is broken at the moment and we can't get enough fitters to fix the system, we actually have to try to identify some of the pinch points and put in changes. And what is the best change you can put in to move change through fast? It's quotas. So I do think that I'd like to see some intelligent quotas. You know, in Norway, they put in quotas for women on their largest listed boards, and they basically said if you don't meet 40% target, and they were at something like 12, within 2 years we're going to just delist your company. So they sort of gave them a bit of an incentive. Yeah. Well, they got through that and they achieved that. And I've been to Norway and the sun still comes up. You know, it didn't break the whole country. It didn't break all the things it was supposed to. So I think, to me, what I would like to see is real buy-in to achieving proper equal opportunity, and that buy-in would be evidenced by some real marquee quotas existing in the system somewhere that have been accepted, that have started to bite, or have already got to their outcome.
Along that journey that you've had of really finding your way in career, and you've shared with me some time ago that, you know, in senior executive roles at Westpac, you got how would I describe it? These aren't your words, they're mine, but you got the job of looking after the kitchen, the complexity of the kitchen, because there was all this stuff going on and there was stuff going into the oven. So the operational roles, the complicated, complex operational roles.
At the same time.
I'm really interested. I asked you a double barrel question earlier, which wasn't fair because you answered the second part. I want to come back then to over your journey, you've dealt with some amazing people, you know, some real giants of the Australian corporate landscape. Who would you say are the people in business that have had the most influence over you as a leader, and who have, I guess, helped you evolve and become the person that you've become?
Yeah, so, you know, a lot of them are people that were at Westpac. You know, I talked about the strengths and having people on your team. Where did I get that from? I got that from John Michelle, who was my boss at Westpac for a period. He ran Lend Lease MLC. and became the chairman of the ANZ Bank. So he's somebody who had a massive intellect, but had really worked out how to get the best out of a team. Helen Lynch has been a really strong mentor of mine. She was the first woman to ever be the manager of a bank branch in Australia, and for a girl who started as a teller at the local branch in Charleville in Queensland, who's been openly gay pretty much all of her career and is now in her late 70s, that's an unusual person. And she taught me a great deal about respecting yourself and knowing yourself and wanting to, press forward through that. But, I have been incredibly fortunate to sort of sit and watch and learn from so many different leaders that it's super hard to sort of pick out who are the ones. And when you see someone that's truly exceptional and you see the charisma that comes with that confidence. I remember the first time that I had an opportunity to sort of see Bill Clinton do his thing, from about 8 feet away. That was a real eye-popping moment for me as well. And
with the presence?
Yeah, the presence and the charisma. But not only that, but the understanding of it and the measured use of it in terms of getting the message across. And, it was post him being president when he was working very hard around some of the educational and health initiatives and so forth that he and his wife were interested in at that point in time. And I'm always attracted to leaders that have got intellect because I think that gives you the ability to address and solve some of the larger problems that you see. That's one of the reasons why I enjoy observing Rob Scott at Wesfarmers, because he's got a really very strong intellect, great grasp of all the numbers all of the time. It surrounds himself with very strong people and also people who, have a good fit with each other. So he understands the curation of a team. And having been curated into a few teams by leaders like that, that's something I find very appealing. So how good's a leader? They're as good as their team, and they're probably as good as the weakest link in the team. And as a non-executive director, if you're not hearing from the CEO about who that weakest link is and how that weakest link is going to be removed from the team or moved into a spot where they're not the weakest link, if you're not hearing that, that's when radar goes up and when you feel the problems are on foot.
Yeah. So I'm going to loop back to somewhere near where we started out.
Okay.
Because your mum and dad have been huge influence on you.
Yeah.
I normally finish this up with one of the questions, what are the couple of leadership, traits that you think are really important that we should all be following and we should all be observing to help us be successful in life? I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to ask you, what are the key things you learned from your mum and dad?
Well, my mum and dad, like I said, they built the house that I lived in. They weren't afraid at all of hard work. And they were very much direct action people. So when you say I'm a doer, that's clearly where I got that from. But I also got this sort of sense of wanting justice and feeling very annoyed about injustice and when it's not fair and it's not equitable. So that's another one of the reasons why I'm such a strong advocate for gender equity. But my mum taught me a couple of really interesting lessons. One of the things she taught me was that it's really important to be as authentic and as truthful as you can possibly be. And my mum will be 90 next week on Thursday, so happy birthday, Mum. And, she's been a religious person of faith all of her life. So when I would say, my mum always told me don't tell a lie, people would say, oh, that's because your mum believes in God and she thinks you're going to go to hell. No, my mother's a very practical woman. And she said to me, and I was only a little kid, 3 or 4. She said, very important. If you tell a lie, you then have to remember who you told what lie to. And that's very, very difficult. And you hear that in leadership stuff where instead of telling the truth and being really authentic and making the case and the argument, you hear leaders say what they think people want to hear. And the message will always have a bit of spin to it. And at the end of the day, there's not much distance between spin and lie. So that was a really important thing that Mum taught me. Mum also taught me that benchmarking is something to be dealt with a great deal of suspicion.
As in comparing yourself to others? Or?
Yes, benchmarking is to be dealt with a great deal of suspicion. I wanted to go out until after midnight, and I said to my mother, "Of course, Mum, that's fine, because I'm the same age as Denise, and Denise is allowed to go out until 2 o'clock in the morning." And Mum looked me right in the eye and she said, "I don't care what Denise does, it's what you do that counts. And at the end of the day, that's the most important thing for a leader. It's what you do that actually counts. So stop comparing yourself to everybody else. Stop all this benchmarking nonsense and just get on and do what it is that you need to do."
How about your dad?
Well, Dad was there along the way with all of those lessons as well, and completely, on message with those lessons. Dad was a professional athlete. He earned more money from foot running than he earned from being an apprentice boilermaker when I was a tiny little kid. And so from my dad, I got my competitive spirit, and I got an understanding about preparation. My dad could fix anything. I remember going out with some mates in Middle Harbour on a 50-foot boat with a big set of sails and a motor, and we had to come home under motor. When the wind went down, it's the middle of the night and this thing stops working, and these three sort of very high-powered and highly paid funds managers all went like headless chooks, and Mum and Dad were visiting and we'd been guests on the boat, and Dad said, "Derek, can I have a look below? Is there an engine or something here?" And Derek was like, "He's got this, seriously expensive boat. And here's my retired old dad, wants to have a look. Got a torch." So Dad went down with his torch, and you could see Derek was a bit, "Oh, Johnny, no, draftsman, boilermaker, taught a few." Goes, "Derek, just have a look. See here, this side does this and that. They don't look the same, Derek, and don't you think they should?" And the boys looked and they had a big get, and so this got moved and that got moved and this got tightened and that got tightened, turn it over and off we went. And so Dad was one of these people that is just look and listen, understand the other person's perspective. He used to say, "There's only one spot, Diane, that a dog can't scratch, and it's right under its chin. And if you scratch that dog under the chin, you'll have a friend for life. So with people, find the spot under their chin."
Beautiful. That's a lovely, lovely place to finish. Diane, thank you so much for joining me on Leadership on the Front Foot. I think that's been a very, very rich conversation for everybody in the audience. And thank you for your part in it. Thank you for your questions. I really appreciate it. As I say, Leadership on the Front Foot is available on the Capital Partners website, on YouTube, and very shortly on your favourite podcast program. Our next episode will be in 2 weeks' time, and I'll be speaking with Andy Crane, who is the Chancellor of Curtin University, and there's a bit going on in the tertiary education sector at the moment, so keep an eye out for the notification. Make sure you register, and I hope you join us next time. Diane, thanks again for joining us.
Very much my pleasure. Thank you, everybody.